an aircraft dismissed by every expert as unfit, underpowered, or structurally impossible keeps proving them wrong, right up to becoming the safest bomber in RAF service, while the humble materials that made it a wonder also concealed a fatal, denied flaw. At precisely 11:00 in the morning on January 30th, 1943, Reichsmarshal Hermann Göring stepped up to a microphone in Berlin to deliver a nationwide radio address marking the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. Families across Germany had gathered around their radios to hear the commander of the Luftwaffe boast of German air supremacy. Then, mid-sentence, his voice vanished, replaced by muffled cries of alarm and a burst of static. Somewhere above the German capital, at 20,000 feet, 3 aircraft had just cut Göring off in front of his own nation. When he looked up, what he saw climbing away was not a squadron of heavy bombers, but 3 planes built from little more than plywood and glue, carrying no guns at all. How had an unarmed aircraft made of wood become the one weapon the mighty Luftwaffe could not keep out of its own capital, not once but twice in a single afternoon? The story began years earlier, with a problem that seemed to have no solution. In the late 1930s, as Europe edged toward war, Britain's Royal Air Force faced a basic dilemma. Its bombers were too slow to survive. The accepted fix was more guns, more turrets, more armored gun positions and ammunition belts threaded through the fuselage. Bombers under development at the time, like the Avro Manchester and the Handley Page Halifax, were built to fight their way through. But every gun added weight, every turret added drag, the gunners, their oxygen bottles, their heated flight suits, all of it dragged the aircraft slower, which made them easier targets, which meant they needed still more guns to survive, which made them slower still. It was a vicious cycle nobody seemed able to break. One designer, however, thought he saw a way out. Geoffrey de Havilland had built his career on speed. His DH-88 Comet Racer had dominated air races through the 1930s, and his DH-91 Albatross airliner, made largely of wood, cruised at 210 miles an hour, faster than many fighters of the previous decade. De Havilland wrote to Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman with a radical idea. Strip out the guns, the turrets, the gunners entirely. Build a bomber so fast that enemy fighters simply could not catch it, and build it not from metal, but from wood, since war would bring shortages of aluminum and steel, while timber remained plentiful, and since furniture makers and piano factories could build it without touching the skilled metalworkers needed for Spitfires and Hurricanes. Freeman, who had commanded a squadron of fast de Havilland bombers back in the Great War, trusted the company's instincts and thought there was something to it. Yet he was nearly alone. The rest of the air ministries laughed the proposal out of the room. How would a wooden airframe survive high-speed flight and battle damage? How could furniture makers hold the precision tolerances of a warplane? What happened if it turned out slower than promised, or if enemy fighters simply got faster? Lord Beaverbrook, the Minister of Aircraft Production, dismissed the whole idea as Freeman's folly. In October 1938, de Havilland was told to drop the project and go build wings for other companies' bombers instead. So he quietly kept working anyway. By September 1939, he had detailed estimates ready for both single and twin-engined versions. The outbreak of war that same month made the Air Ministry only slightly more receptive, and skepticism lingered even after a full-scale mock-up was demonstrated. But official backing finally arrived in late December 1939. On January 1, 1940, determined to prove the doubters wrong, de Havilland declared that his new aircraft, designated the DH-98, would be the fastest bomber in the world, adding, "It must be useful." An order for a single prototype in February grew to 50 aircraft by March 1. Lingering doubts about an unarmed bomber's usefulness eased once officials realized the same airframe could double as a night fighter, bristling with 4 20mm cannons, 303 machine guns and interception radar. By June, the DH-98 finally had a name, Mosquito. Even with backing secured, Beaverbrook kept trying to have the project scrapped, and the Battle of Britain's constant air raid warnings ate into factory time all summer. Still, by November 1940, the first prototype was ready. On November 25th, painted bright yellow and coded E0234, it prepared for its maiden flight at Hatfield Airfield, north of London. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the designer's son, and the company's chief test pilot, climbed in alongside John Walker, the chief engine installation designer. The two Merlin 21 engines caught, and the aircraft lifted cleanly into gray skies for a flight lasting 1 hour and 42 minutes. The report afterward was cautiously optimistic, calling the handling stable and the controls responsive, with only minor fixes needed for the undercarriage doors and a slight wing drag. But when testing resumed in December, a far more serious problem surfaced. At speeds between 240 and 255 miles an hour, violent buffeting shook the tail, caused by airflow breaking off the engine nacelles and battering the tailplane. Engineers taped wool tufts to the wings to trace the airflow, then tried slots in the nacelles and the tailplane's leading edge. The buffeting persisted for months. Not until February 1941 did they find the actual fix. Triangular fillets on the wing's trailing edge, combined with extended engine nacelles. This time it worked. With the buffeting solved, the prototype, now carrying the military serial W450, faced its real test. A speed trial against a Spitfire. Mark II, the Mosquito, had roughly twice the surface area and twice the weight of the Spitfire, but also twice the power, and engineers guessed it might come out perhaps 20 miles an hour faster. They were wrong. The Mosquito hit 392 miles an hour at 22,000 feet, 32 miles an hour faster than the Spitfire's 360, and at 6,000 feet it left the fighter behind entirely. Freeman's gamble had paid off. An unarmed, wooden aircraft was about to become the fastest operational airplane in all of Britain. That speed came at a price, though. A fully loaded Mosquito needed to reach 172 miles an hour before losing an engine was survivable, the highest critical speed of any twin-engine aircraft in the war. Below it, losing an engine meant the aircraft would roll inverted into the ground within seconds, unless the pilot instantly cut power to the other side. Crews learned to hold the plane on the runway far longer than instinct wanted, pulling up only yards from the far end. One hesitation, and two highly trained men were lost. Speed alone had won the engineering argument. Whether it could keep crews alive in combat was still an open question, and the answer was coming fast. The Americans, for their part, weren't convinced. In April 1941, General Henry Hap Arnold saw a demonstration and carried the design plans home, where 5 American manufacturers were asked to weigh in. Beechcraft's assessment captured the mood. The design, in their words, appears as though this airplane has sacrificed serviceability, structural strength, ease of construction, and flying characteristics in an attempt to use construction material which is not suitable for the manufacture of efficient airplanes. The United States passed instead. De Havilland pressed on with Britain alone. On September 17, 1941, an unarmed photo reconnaissance Mosquito flew its first operational sortie from RAF Benson, climbing to 23,000 feet over occupied territory. 3 Messerschmitt fighters rose to intercept what looked like an easy kill. The Mosquito simply outran them. No guns fired, no evasive tricks needed, and came home untouched. It was exactly the aircraft de Havilland had promised. Nothing could catch it, so it did not need to fight. On November 15, 1941, the first operational bomber variant reached No. 105 Squadron at RAF Swanton Morley, impressing the crews used to older Blenheims, all except the air gunners, who suddenly had no job left to do. In January 1942, a night fighter version joined No. 157 Squadron, replacing its aging Douglas Havocks. But production crawled, and months passed before the bomber variant flew its first real mission. That moment finally came on May 30, 1942, when RAF Bomber Command launched its first 1,000-bomber raid, turning Cologne into an inferno overnight. 4 Mosquitoes weren't part of that main force, but flew a follow-up strike the next morning, skimming over the smoking city in broad daylight to drop bombs, photograph the results, and race home before defenses could react. It set the pattern: small formations of mosquitoes hitting targets in fast daylight raids right after major night attacks, keeping air raid sirens wailing across German cities and grinding down morale. That August, a new commanding officer took over No. 105 Squadron and refined the approach further, ordering low-level attacks timed to strike 20 minutes before dusk, then escape under cover of darkness. Flying this way through the autumn of 1942, the squadron did not lose a single aircraft to enemy fighters. Which brings the story back to Berlin and to January 30, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, and one of the most sacred dates on the Nazi calendar. As Reichsmarschall Göring prepared his 11 a.m. address, 3 Mosquitoes from No. 105 Squadron arrived overhead at 20,000 feet, safely above effective flak range, and released their bombs just as he began to speak. The broadcast cut out mid-sentence, replaced by confused voices and then dead air. German radio scrambled to reschedule, and at 40 p.m., Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels stepped up to deliver his own anniversary address to a nation still embarrassed by the morning's failure. The afternoon broadcast was interrupted in exactly the same way. On the single most important propaganda day of the year, Nazi leadership had been silenced twice by an aircraft that carried no weapons whatsoever. The psychological damage rippled outward. If the Luftwaffe couldn't even protect a scheduled radio broadcast over its own capital, what could it actually protect? The myth of invincibility was cracking in public, in real time. Göring's fury became legendary. Months later, lecturing German aircraft manufacturers, he erupted, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, knock together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building, and they give it a speed which they have now increased, yet again. What do you make of that? There is nothing the British do not have. They have the geniuses, and we have the nincompoops." Through the spring of 1943, Mosquito squadrons kept up the pressure at every hour of the day. Daylight strikes on factories, dusk raids on rail yards, night missions over cities, and German air defenses simply couldn't keep pace. On April 20, timed deliberately to coincide with Hitler's 54th birthday, No. 105 Squadron hit Berlin again with precision, losing only a single aircraft. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris, head of Bomber Command, took notice. If Mosquitoes could reliably crack Berlin's defenses, they were worth more than nuisance value. In May 1943, numbers 105 and 139 squadrons moved to No. 8 Pathfinder Group, combining their bombing role with target marking, arriving ahead of the main bomber stream to lay down flares before the Lancasters and Halifaxes followed. It was the ideal job for a fast wooden aircraft, quick enough to beat German night fighters into position, agile enough to dodge the flak that shredded slower planes, and, with production finally catching up, numerous enough for increasingly ambitious operations. The Germans did not take the humiliation quietly. That summer, Göring personally ordered 2 new Luftwaffe units, built specifically to hunt down the wooden bombers. Jagd Geschwader 25, under Lieutenant Colonel Herbert E. Lufeld, and Jagd Geschwader 50, under Major Hermann Graf, staffed with elite pilots flying the best aircraft available. They achieved almost nothing. The Mosquitoes were simply too fast to catch with any consistency. Meanwhile, the night fighter variants hunted the darkness with equal success, earning a nickname among German aircrews: Mosquito Schreck, the Mosquito Terror, the fear that a wooden shadow might be waiting as they came in to land. Wing Commander Brance Burbridge became the RAF's most successful night fighter pilot, credited with 21 German aircraft from a Mosquito cockpit, and some German pilots, once they realized a Mosquito had found them, chose to crash land immediately rather than risk becoming another kill marked on a British fuselage. By early 1944, the Mosquito had proven itself across occupied Europe many times over. But on February 18th, it took on a mission unlike anything before, a jailbreak from the air. Inside Amiens prison in northern France, over 700 French resistance fighters were awaiting execution. Many of them key figures in networks the Allies needed intact for the coming invasion. A ground assault deep inside occupied territory was impossible, and conventional bombing couldn't breach walls 3 feet thick without killing everyone inside them. Only a precision strike by Mosquitoes offered a way. Operation Jericho called for 19 Mosquitoes from numbers 464, 487, and 21 squadrons to hit the prison in 3 low-level waves. The first breaching the outer walls, the second destroying the guards' barracks, the third striking the main building. All within a narrow window, too early, and the Germans might execute prisoners in panic. Too late, and the opportunity would be gone. The Mosquitoes crossed the channel at wave-top height and raced across the French countryside at 270 miles an hour, barely clearing hedgerows, too low and too fast for German flak to find them. The first wave blew open the outer wall, exactly as planned, and the second demolished the guards' quarters as soldiers scrambled for cover. In the chaos, roughly 258 prisoners escaped through the breached walls and vanished into the countryside before German reinforcements could respond. The cost was steep. Group Captain Percy Pickard, the legendary pilot leading the raid, was shot down and killed, along with the crews of 2 other Mosquitoes. And the bombing itself killed more than 100 prisoners, a toll that made the mission controversial even at the time. But among those who escaped were resistance leaders whose networks proved essential once the invasion finally came. By the end of 1944, though, the Mosquito met an opponent it genuinely couldn't outrun, the Messerschmitt jet. The twin-jet Me-262 could exceed 540 miles an hour, nearly 150 miles an hour faster than the Mosquito, and for the first time in over 2 years of service, the wooden wonder could no longer rely on raw speed to guarantee survival. On January 13, 1945, Lieutenants Richard Kenny and Arnold Kuhn were on a weather reconnaissance flight over Germany at 30, 0 feet when 2 Me-262s appeared 4 to 5 miles behind them. Kenny dove for cloud cover near Hanover, but the jets closed anyway, cannon fire flashing from their noses. For 9 terrifying minutes, from 30,000 feet down to 12,000, Kenny threw the Mosquito through violent corkscrew turns while the jet attacked again and again without ever landing a clean hit. At 12,000 feet, low on fuel or ammunition, the German pilot finally broke off, pulled alongside briefly, waved, and turned back toward Berlin. Other crews weren't so lucky in the exchange, or so fortunate in the outcome. On January 21st, Lieutenant Richard Geary and Navigator Floyd Mann, flying an escorted mission to the Politz oil refinery in Poland, were jumped repeatedly by Me-262s. In one pass, Geary threw his aircraft into a maneuver so violent he later admitted, "I don't know what kind of maneuver this was, and it is a miracle the aircraft did not disintegrate," forcing the German fighter to break off just feet from his canopy to avoid a collision. On March 20, 1945, Lieutenant Roger Gilbert wasn't as fortunate. Cannon shells tore 4 feet off his Mosquito's outer left wing, and though he wrestled the crippled aircraft back to England, he refused to fly it again once he saw how it was repaired, telling his squadron commander, "My God, Major, I'm not going to fly that damn plane." They cut the wing off, and all they did was glue another one back on. Gilbert's complaint about glue turned out to be more prophetic than he knew. Thousands of miles away, in India and Southeast Asia, where Mosquito squadrons had been deploying since 1944 to support the war against Japan, aircraft were failing catastrophically in mid-air, wings separating from fuselages, upper surfaces lifting clean off the main spars, crews dying in crashes nobody could initially explain. Major Hereward de Havilland traveled to India in December 1944 to investigate, and his report concluded that the accidents were not caused by the deterioration of the glue, but by shrinkage of the airframe during the wet monsoon season, pinning the blame on heat, humidity, and termites. But a later inquiry by the Ministry of Aircraft Production told a very different story. Investigators examined crashed Mosquitos built at de Havilland's own Hatfield and Leavesden plants, in 6 different production variants, none of which had ever been near a monsoon or a termite. The defects were identical anyway. The problem wasn't the climate, it was, all along, the workmanship, and the investigators said so plainly. The standard of gluing left much to be desired. Manufacturing flaws at British factories, not the tropics, had built structural weaknesses into aircraft that only showed themselves under real operational strain. The furniture makers and piano factories that had once seemed like the Mosquito's great advantage now looked, in this instance, like its liability. And yet, even with loss of control accidents occurring 3 times more often in Mosquitos than in any other RAF aircraft type, the Air Ministry chose to keep blaming the climate rather than the construction, unwilling to shake confidence in a fleet it now depended on. Despite the jets and the buried scandal, the Mosquito kept flying through the war's final weeks. On May 21, 1945, 2 weeks after VE Day, Mosquitoes from numbers 143 and 248 squadrons flew the aircraft's last official European combat mission, hunting U-boats that might refuse to surrender. By then, the bomber variant had quietly achieved something remarkable, the lowest loss rate of any aircraft type in RAF Bomber Command service. The idea that had looked like lunacy in 1938, an unarmed bomber staking everything on speed instead of guns, had turned out safer than the heavily armored, gun-bristling fortresses it was supposed to be too fragile to compete with. The fighter variants, never originally intended for air combat at all, ended the war credited with 487 German aircraft destroyed. And then, almost as fast as it had proven itself indispensable, it became surplus. The RAF demobilized quickly, squadrons disbanded, and airframes that had been irreplaceable months earlier were suddenly spare parts. A handful lingered into the 1950s towing targets and training new pilots, far from the glory of Berlin and Amiens, but most were simply burned or scrapped. Of the 781 Mosquitoes ever built, only around 30 survive today, and just 5 remain airworthy. Even so, the de Havilland Aircraft Museum in Hertfordshire holds 3 of them, including W450, the very first prototype, the only original prototype of a British World War. 2 aircraft designs still in existence in the 21st century. It is worth sitting with what that wooden aircraft actually was. Lord Beaverbrook called it a folly, Beechcraft called it structurally unfit to be an efficient airplane. Its own government spent years quietly blaming the weather for a flaw in its own factories, rather than admit the glue joints were bad. And still, built by piano makers and furniture craftsmen out of a material every expert in the room had said was unsuitable for war, it silenced the Luftwaffe's own propaganda machine twice in a single afternoon, outflew Spitfires, evaded jets, broke a French prison wide open, and finished the war as the safest bomber the Royal Air Force ever put in the sky. The wonder, in the end, was never really about the wood. It was about how much could be built from something everyone else had already decided was worthless.